Hi everyone, welcome back to tTt To Tell Transform. Today we're so glad to welcome back our guest performer, the legendary, the icon of the music of our time, Bruce Brubaker, also the piano chair of New England Conservatory. So welcome back, Bruce.
Thank you.
So let's kick things off first with your latest album, Eno Piano. Can you talk a bit about it?
This project started with my interest in trying to make a really long, sustained sound out of a piano. I had seen a jazz pianist using a device that's called an e-bow. It's something that electric guitar players use. And it's a kind of magnet that attaches to a guitar string, and it allows that string to vibrate for a long time. A normal e-bow, like electric guitar players use, doesn't really fit inside a piano. So then I became aware that there was an inventor, Florent Colutti, and he, in France, was working on another kind of electromagnetic device, which was basically the same idea, but specifically made so that it would work in a piano. And that's what we ended up using for this album. And these electromagnets, we call them bows, are hanging inside the piano, suspended over strings. And through the current that comes out of these bows, it's possible to make a string vibrate without making a diminuendo, without getting softer. And you can hear all kinds of interesting colors from this because the strings, as they keep vibrating, make sounds that are coming out of an acoustic piano, but some of these sounds we've never heard before because we're not used to hearing, for example, a bass string just keep vibrating. And it has all kinds of very interesting artifacts in it.
Yeah, I think you are making a pianist's dream come true because piano is a decrescendo instrument.
Absolutely.
When I listened to your music, I felt like I was instantly being drawn into a different dimension. I felt it was timeless and hypnotic at some sense. Like, what is this magic behind it?
Well, I think that the relationship between sound and time is something that you do become aware of in a different way in ambient music, which is the thing that Eno really created with this music back in the 1970s. And it's a music where there are long sounds and there is a lot of resonance. And I think the listener's sense of the passage of time does change because things happen mostly very slowly. But at the same time, even though the changes are not super obvious, but they are constant. So all the time, as you hear these long sounds, there are little differences, little alterations, little extra sounds that are added on. And so it's both very slow and at the same time, a kind of hyper awareness.
But I think your experiments on new technology is so fascinating because right now we have so many softwares like Allatonceness or engineers that are working on computer and just can change the sounds to an ambient sound or different rooms. But you are actually experienced with the piano itself and you're turning piano into a studio itself, which is fascinating. And as a listener, I'm curious, when you recording on that piano, what's the feeling like when you play on that new blending of the new sound and colors?
Well, it was quite challenging because actually, as they exist right now, these electromagnetic bows are fairly fragile, and it isn't yet possible to do a live performance with all of that happening at the same time. So in order to make the album, we really used many layers of sound and recording. So I recorded sometimes just the acoustic piano, sometimes we recorded the bows all by themselves, and we even made some of those bow sounds using a second piano, which was a different kind of piano that was more resonant in certain parts, certain registers. And that was another little piano that was in a different room from the main studio. And so we were able to even work on those things at the same time in some cases. So it really was a layering process. When I play it live now, I use a conventional acoustic piano and I'm using samples that were created during that recording project, and I'm able to trigger those from the stage. But I'm really hoping that we will be able to play the whole thing live. My first idea was to have two instruments on the stage, one with the bows inside and the other one that I would play in the conventional way, and that they would both be resonating together on the stage. I think it would be really fun.
Because I sense that there's a parallel relationship between your project and his ideas of how to play around with the studio, or do you don't see it that way?
Yeah, well, in fact, I tried to kind of turn it backwards, because one of the things that Brian said a long time ago was that the studio, the recording studio, can be a musical instrument, he said. And so my idea was that with this project, we could take a piece of music, his music for airports, which really was a studio product, and render it as something that could be played with an instrument. So instead of saying a studio can be an instrument, I was trying to say, well, actually an instrument can be a studio.
Wow.
One of the things that happened with this Eno project is that in the very beginning, I made scores, I made written music for these pieces that had only existed as sound recordings. There were no scores. So that was a first part of the project and involved a lot of listening, but I think also a lot of thought, because often his recordings include sounds that are not exactly fitting into a classical music sense of what would be a pitched sound. So how do you use that? How do you decide whether to include it or just to leave it out? And perhaps even to allow other things to come in that are not in the original. So that whole process of transcription, arrangement, it was a very intriguing part of the process.
Do you usually discuss with that process with the original composer?
No. And I think for me, that's actually kind of important. So I have this feeling that after composers, or maybe we don't even like the word composer anymore, after musicians make some music, either by writing it down or by making a recording in sound, that once that is finished, then that music becomes something that other musicians can use. And even though in some places in the world we do have a sense of ownership about those things, and we talk of copyright or performance right, but artistically I think that once music has been made, then it becomes something that other people can use and read and change, and inevitably change. So even when you're trying to make a very precise copy of something, you really can't. And by making those differences, by making those changes, you always end up creating a new piece of art. And I think that's always been happening. I mean, you can see it in long ago when you think about Yunnan and Peritan, or if you think about people in the 19th century transcribing music from one medium to another medium, or more recently, the way in pop music, the phenomenon of cover songs is absolutely a part of what we expect people to do. A recording is made, maybe a big hit, and then other people come along and, as they say in pop, cover it. They record it again, but they don't really copy it precisely. They change things, they may even change many things, to the point where it might almost be not recognizable anymore. So I think that really is a really interesting and important thing that artists do. You know, there are theorists about art who say that now, in our time, we're living in a period of post-production art. And I guess the meaning of that is that it's not possible now to make something that is really original and really new. And so the only possibility now is to reuse things that already exist. And I think there is some truth in that.
I think so too.
But it's also been going on for a long time.
I remember that you put a line, which is all I wantness, under your title of your journal blog. Yeah, can you talk about a bit of that part?
Well, that word, all at onceness, is actually a word that was made by Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian thinker and media theorist. And I'm not sure I could get this quite right, but he says something like, we live in a brand new world of all at onceness. Time has stopped, space has vanished. We live in a global village.
Yes.
So all those words come together in this incredible passage from his book in the 1960s. And what is he talking about? Well, I think he is talking about how electronic technology, he was talking about television, but we might be thinking about the internet and the whole online world, that technology has collapsed time and space so that things now happen all at once. So when I'm doing something, somebody thousands of miles away could be participating, could see it, could hear it. And so, yeah, those things that used to seem so separating, like geographical distance or, in fact, time, really are very different in our world. And I think when you think of music, it really is clear that the resources we have, just in something as simple as hearing recordings of music, pretty much every recording, I'm overstating a little bit, is now available online at any moment. You can get it right now. And that really has changed the way music exists. So I think that, yes, all-at-onceness probably is a kind of description of our world. And it might be a frightening thing, but it's also a thing, a condition that allows us to have certain possibilities for expression and making combinations of art that really couldn't have been possible before. And a lot of the music that interests me is music where time seems to be happening in two ways at the same time. So I find that is a kind of music that I am very drawn to, where in the music there might be a feeling of slow, gradual change. Sometimes that's in the low register, but at the same time that slow, gradual change is happening, there could be other events which are happening very quickly, maybe in the high register. And so as that happens, the listener gets this layered experience of existence, really, and it does match our lives. That you have some sense that things might be evolving, that you might be getting to some goal in a longer sense, but on the surface there is this busyness of every day, every minute, and those things happen at the same time.
Yeah, because I was just thinking we talk about being classical music, and when playing with minimalism music, the listeners as audiences, they listen differently, they approach differently as well. Yeah. So I'm just thinking that probably music can be more dimensional rather than just time art, but can be also space art.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we don't think enough about that, and often I sometimes say to students, if you imagine that especially in maybe slower music, I think we often tend to imagine that a slower tempo means a smaller space, but maybe that's not correct. And it's interesting that one of the basic tempo indications, which is taken as a slow tempo, and I'm thinking of the word largo, it doesn't really have anything to do with time. Largo is a description of space, right? The English word large. So when Beethoven writes largo, is he telling you to play slowly? Not really. I think he's telling you to play bigly, and that's very interesting. So it's different. It's not the same thing. And you can imagine maybe, taking very quiet steps, but large ones, so that this tempo, which is going by in a slow beat, but that the space you're covering with those steps is actually a large one. So yeah, I think we make mistakes about that all the time. The way a piece of art can represent space is something that's quite variable. We know that from artwork or from photographs. You know that when you're looking at a photograph, the physical object might be quite small, but it could be a photograph of a mountain, as it is over there on the wall. And we understand in our minds that that's representing a huge space, even though the photograph is this large. At the same time, the same photograph could be representing something microscopic.
Yes.
So the equation of the space that is in the representation is totally not mapping directly onto what's being represented. Same thing with time. So think about movies, is a 2-hour-long film a representation of 2 hours of somebody's life? Almost never. Almost never. It's always been radically compressed. So you know very well. You're watching the movie and the person is doing something, and then the next thing you know, a week has gone by and now they're doing something else. And we take that as a normal thing in a film, that this time change is part of what makes movies movies. The occasional movie that does make an actual congruence of time and time in the film is shocking. I don't know if you know any of those movies. There's a Canadian artist, Chantal Ackerman. She made a movie called Jeanne Delmain, and in that movie, it's a very sad, terrible movie actually, but there's a scene in the kitchen where the character is boiling potatoes, and the potatoes go into a pot and they boil for 40 minutes or something, and you see it, and it takes 40 minutes in the movie, and it's extremely tedious. I'm not going to say boring, but it's very tedious. And as a result, though, of that shock, then when the major action of the film, I won't spoil it, happens later, I think it is amplified and intensified because of this extremely slow scene in the kitchen. And when something finally happens dramatically, then it's really shocking. So yeah, some artists are using that, but for the most part, we don't make that direct connection. And yet in music, I think we don't really think about that enough. So we should be thinking about it, that time can pass in many ways.